"You need to get away from that child, now!" the security guard shouted, his hand already reaching for his radio. Margaret Chen pressed herself against the cold brick wall of the shopping centre, her worn fingers gripping the shoulder of the terrified little girl who had been wandering alone through the parking lot for the past 20 minutes. Beside her tank, her scarred 50-pound Pitbull with one torn ear stood rigid, his entire muscular body vibrating with a low, constant growl directed at the white minivan idling 30 feet away, engine running, tinted windows hiding whoever waited inside. The guard took another step forward, his face twisted with disgust at the sight of Margaret's filthy jacket and the dog's battle-worn appearance, completely dismissing the desperate truth in her eyes. What he couldn't see, what nobody rushing past with their shopping bags wanted to see, was that this homeless woman and her damaged rescue dog were the only things standing between this child and whoever had been following her since she wandered away from her mother near the food court. This is a story about the people society has trained itself not to see, the invisible ones we step around on sidewalks and avoid in parking lots, the ones we've decided don't matter enough to hear. It's about a woman who lost everything except her humanity, and a dog that the world labeled dangerous, and how on one ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a Phoenix shopping center, their refusal to look away saved a life while everyone else was too busy, too uncomfortable, too convinced that homeless people were the problem rather than fellow human beings. Because sometimes the people we've been taught to fear are the only ones paying attention when evil is happening right in front of us. Sometimes the dog everyone crosses the street to avoid is the hero nobody saw coming. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching this story from. I love knowing where you all are. Let me take you back to that day, to the Desert Sky Pavilion Shopping Center on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, when the temperature was still hitting 95 degrees and the asphalt shimmered like water. Margaret Chen was 52 years old, though the sun and streets had aged her face beyond those years. She had been homeless for 3 years, living in a borrowed tent in a ravine where homeless people congregated, a 20-minute walk from this shopping center where she came twice a week to search through the dumpsters behind the grocery store after the evening throws. Her black hair, streaked with silver, hung in a tangled braid down her back. Her clothes were layers of donated items that didn't quite match. A men's khaki jacket, 3 sizes too large over a faded purple t-shirt, jeans with holes in both knees that she'd patched with duct tape, and sneakers so worn the soles flapped when she walked. Her hands were calloused and rough, fingernails permanently rimmed with dirt, no matter how many times she scrubbed them in public restroom sinks. But her eyes, dark brown and alert, still held the sharp intelligence of the woman she had been before everything collapsed. Margaret had been a registered nurse for 23 years, working the night shift in the pediatric intensive care unit at Phoenix Children's Hospital. She had owned a modest 2-bedroom house in Maryvale, drove a reliable Honda Civic, had a retirement account, and a mortgage she paid on time every month. She had been married to David, a postal worker, for 18 years. They had tried for children, but it never happened, so they poured their love into their nephew, David's sister's son, taking him every other weekend, attending his Little League games, planning to help with college. Her life wasn't extraordinary, but it was hers, stable and good and enough. The collapse came fast, the way it always does when multiple disasters strike at once. David had a massive heart attack while sorting mail one morning in July, 3 years ago. He was 51, dead before the ambulance arrived. Margaret was working a double shift when the hospital administrator found her to deliver the news. She remembered the fluorescent lights of the hallway, the smell of antiseptic, the way her knees had simply stopped working. They had some life insurance, enough to cover the funeral, but not enough to cover the mortgage alone on her salary when the medical bills from his emergency care started arriving. Bills for those desperate minutes of attempted resuscitation that hadn't worked. She had taken on extra shifts, working 60, 70 hours a week, barely sleeping, swallowing her grief in the rhythm of work. She lasted 6 months before she made the mistake, the one mistake in 23 years that ended everything. She had been awake for 36 hours straight, covering for a sick colleague when she prepared an IV medication for a 7-year-old girl recovering from heart surgery. Exhausted, devastated, running on caffeine and despair, Margaret had miscalculated the dosage. Not by much. The child was fine. Another nurse caught it within minutes. But the error was in the chart, undeniable, and Margaret Chen, who had been a model employee for over 2 decades, was fired within a week. The hospital couldn't take risks with medication errors, they explained, especially in pediatrics. She understood. She had always been the one who said the rules existed for a reason, but understanding didn't stop the consequences. Without her income, she lost the house 4 months later. She had moved into a cheap motel, then to her car when the savings ran out, then to the streets when the car was repossessed for missing payments. She had applied for dozens of jobs, but nursing positions required references, and hers came with the red flag of termination. Retail and food service jobs took one look at her address, none, and moved to the next applicant. The social services system was so overwhelmed it took months to process applications, and by the time she qualified for assistance, she was already deep in the survival mode of homelessness, the kind that grinds you down day by day until you're too tired to navigate bureaucracy. David's sister, the one with the nephew they'd loved, had stopped returning her calls after Margaret asked to borrow money. Friends from the hospital had drifted away, uncomfortable with her new reality, unsure how to help, eventually just disappearing like everyone else. Margaret had been on the streets for about 4 months when she found Tank, or rather, when Tank found her. She had been sleeping in an alley behind an abandoned mechanics shop one February night when she woke to a sound, a kind of whimpering that cut through her exhausted sleep. 20 feet away, partially hidden behind a dumpster, was a Pitbull, adult male, maybe 3 or 4 years old, lying on his side. His coat was brindle brown and black stripes, but it was matted with blood. One ear was torn nearly in half, hanging at an ugly angle. His ribs showed through his skin. There were scars on his face and legs, the kind Margaret recognized immediately from her years in pediatrics when they'd sometimes get children injured in dog attacks. These were fighting scars. Someone had used this dog for entertainment, for gambling, had trained him to fight other dogs, and then, when he lost or got too injured to be profitable, had dumped him like garbage. Margaret had approached slowly, making herself small, speaking in the same soft voice she'd used with frightened children in the ICU. "Hey there, sweetheart," she had murmured. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The dog had lifted his head, and she saw his eyes, brown and exhausted and filled with a pain that mirrored her own. She had nothing to offer him, except half a sandwich she'd pulled from a dumpster that morning. She tore it into small pieces and held out her hand. The dog had watched her for a long moment, and then, slowly, painfully, he had dragged himself closer and taken the food from her palm with surprising gentleness. She had spent the next 3 hours petting him, talking to him, and when the sun came up he was still there, his big scarred head resting on her lap. She couldn't take him to a vet, couldn't afford care, but she cleaned his wounds with water from a gas station bathroom, used her own t-shirt as bandages. Over the following weeks, as he healed, they became inseparable. She named him Tank because despite everything he'd been through, he was solid and steady and strong. The ear never healed right. It stayed torn and folded, giving him a lopsided appearance that made people cross the street when they saw him. People assumed he was vicious, dangerous, a fighting dog and therefore a threat. They didn't see what Margaret saw. That Tank was the gentlest soul she'd ever known, that he had somehow survived horror and come out the other side with his capacity for love intact. He never left her side. When she went to dumpsters, he waited. When she slept in doorways, he positioned himself between her and the street. When men approached her aggressively late at night, Tank's low growl was enough to make them reconsider. Life on the streets was a daily humiliation, a constant assault on dignity that civilians couldn't imagine. Margaret woke every morning before dawn because sleeping too long in one place meant police moving you along, or worse, robbery or assault. She spent her days walking, staying visible enough not to be forgotten, but invisible enough not to be harassed. She knew which restaurants threw out good food at what times, which gas stations would let her use the bathroom, which libraries and community centers had air conditioning where she could rest for a few hours. She knew which corners were claimed by other homeless people and which ones were safe to panhandle. She had been spit on, had garbage thrown at her from passing cars, had been called every ugly name people could think of. Teenagers had filmed her sleeping once, posting it online with mocking captions, and she'd heard their laughter as they ran away. The worst part wasn't the hunger or the heat or even the fear. It was the way people looked through her as if she didn't exist. Mothers pulled their children closer when she walked past. Store employees followed her, assuming she was stealing. Police hassled her constantly, demanding she move along from wherever she'd stopped to rest. She understood. She had once been on the other side, had once passed homeless people without really seeing them, caught up in her own busy life. But now, living in this invisible space, she felt herself disappearing a little more each day, her humanity eroding under the weight of constant rejection. Tank was the only one who saw her as a person. Tank was the only reason she kept fighting. About 3 months ago, Margaret had developed a new routine on Tuesdays and Fridays. She would walk the 40 minutes from the ravine to the Desert Sky Pavilion, a sprawling outdoor shopping center with a Target, a Safeway grocery store, several chain restaurants, a movie theater, and dozens of smaller shops. The shopping center didn't allow loitering, but if she kept moving and stayed away from the main entrances, security usually left her alone. She would arrive around 2 in the afternoon, walk the perimeter, rest in the shade behind the Safeway near the loading dock, and wait until evening when the grocery store threw out their expired food. Sometimes she found bread, bruised fruit, dented cans. It was enough to survive. Tank ate whatever she gave him and never complained. On this particular Tuesday, Margaret and Tank had arrived at the shopping center around 2:30. The heat was brutal, the kind of dry Phoenix heat that made breathing feel like inhaling sand. Margaret's water bottle was empty, and she was deciding whether to risk going into the Safeway to refill it at the drinking fountain, or wait until later when fewer people would see her. Tank was panting hard, his tongue hanging out, and she knew she needed to find shade soon. They moved toward the back of the shopping center, away from the main parking lot, toward the service entrance area where delivery trucks unloaded. That's when Margaret first noticed the little girl. She was maybe 5 or 6 years old, wearing pink shorts and a white t-shirt with a unicorn on it, her dark hair in 2 neat braids. She was standing near the dumpsters, 20 feet from where Margaret and Tank had just settled into a patch of shade. The girl looked confused, her head turning back and forth, her small hands twisting the hem of her shirt. Margaret watched her for a moment, expecting to see a parent emerge from one of the nearby stores, but minutes passed and no one came. The girl started walking toward the parking lot, her steps uncertain. Margaret glanced around, waiting for someone to notice, but the handful of people in the area, employees on cigarette breaks, shoppers loading groceries, walked past without looking at the child. The girl reached the parking lot and stopped, now clearly frightened, her lower lip trembling. Margaret stood up, her protective instincts from decades of nursing overriding her street-learned hesitation to draw attention to herself. She took a step forward, Tank immediately rising to follow her. That's when she saw the van. It was a white minivan, older model, maybe a Honda Odyssey, parked 3 rows into the lot. The windows were heavily tinted, dark enough that she couldn't see inside. The van's engine was running. She could see the exhaust shimmer in the heat, and as the little girl moved toward the main shopping center entrance, the van moved too, slowly, staying parallel to her path but keeping distance. Margaret felt Tank stiffen beside her, felt his energy change. The dog's entire focus was locked on that van, his body low and tense, a barely audible growl vibrating in his chest. Margaret's heart started pounding. She had seen enough trauma in her years at the hospital to know predatory behavior when she saw it. This van was following this child. She looked around frantically, trying to find someone, anyone, who looked like they belonged to this little girl. But the parking lot was the usual chaos of shoppers and cars, and nobody was paying attention. The girl was now about 50 feet from the main entrance, heading toward the doors, and the van was creeping forward, maintaining its distance but clearly tracking her movement. "Do something," Margaret told herself. "You have to do something." She hurried forward, Tank matching her pace, his focus never leaving the van. She called out, "Sweetie, hey sweetie, are you lost?" The little girl turned, her face streaked with tears. Margaret reached her in seconds, crouching down to the child's level. "Where's your mommy, honey?" The girl's voice was small and terrified. "I can't find her. We were getting ice cream and I saw a puppy outside and I went to look, and when I came back, she was gone." Margaret glanced back at the van. It had stopped moving, but the engine was still running. Tank was staring at it, every muscle in his body rigid, that low growl getting louder. "Okay, sweetie," Margaret said, keeping her voice calm despite the panic rising in her chest. "Let's go inside and find security. They'll help us find your mum, okay?" She stood up, gently placing her hand on the girl's shoulder to guide her toward the entrance. But as they moved, the van moved too, pulling forward, and Margaret saw the passenger window lower slightly, just an inch or two, enough for someone inside to have a clear view. Tank exploded into motion. The Pitbull lurched forward, barking sharply, his body between Margaret, the child, and the van. The van immediately accelerated, tires screeching slightly as it pulled away, disappearing around the corner of the building toward the other side of the parking lot. Margaret's blood went cold. That wasn't normal. That was the behavior of someone who didn't want to be noticed. She scooped up the little girl, who was now crying harder, frightened by Tank's barking, and hurried toward the main entrance, the dog pressed against her legs, still alert, still watching. The air-conditioned blast of the shopping center interior was shocking after the heat. Margaret carried the girl past startled shoppers who stared at this filthy, homeless woman with a scared Pitbull and a crying child. She headed straight for the security desk near the center of the mall, where two guards sat looking at monitors. "Help," she said breathlessly. "This little girl is lost. She can't find her mother." The younger guard, a white man in his 20s with a buzz cut, looked up with immediate suspicion. His eyes traveled from Margaret's dirty clothes to Tank to the crying child in her arms. "Where did you get that kid?" he demanded, standing up and putting his hand on his radio. "She was alone in the parking lot," Margaret said quickly. "I found her wandering. She said she got separated from her mum near the ice cream place." The guard's face hardened. "Put the child down, right now." His tone wasn't concerned. It was accusatory. Margaret felt the old familiar shame, the automatic assumption that because she was homeless, she must be dangerous, must be the threat. She gently set the girl down, holding up her hands in a placating gesture. "I'm just trying to help," she said. The older guard, an older black man with grey in his hair, had come around the desk and was kneeling in front of the little girl. "Hey there, honey. What's your name?" The girl sniffled. Emma Cooper." The older guard spoke into his radio. "We've got a lost child at Central Security, Emma Cooper, approximately 5 years old, separated from her mother." He looked at Margaret with less hostility than his colleague, but still with wariness. "Can you tell me exactly where you found her?" Margaret explained about the parking lot, about the van, about Tank's reaction. As she spoke, she saw the younger guard's expression shift from suspicion to outright disbelief. "A van following her," he repeated, his tone mocking. "You're saying you saw a kidnapping attempt?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, I think someone was following her." The younger guard laughed, actually laughed, a short bark of derision. "Lady, I think you've been in the sun too long. There's no kidnapping. This kid just wandered off from her mom." The older guard was more diplomatic, but she could see he didn't believe her either. "We'll make an announcement," he said. "Her mother will show up. You can go now." Margaret felt panic surge. "You don't understand," she insisted. "There was a white van, tinted windows. It was following her. It left as soon as my dog barked." The younger guard stepped closer, his voice hardening. "I said you can go. You and that dog need to leave, now." Before Margaret could respond, a woman's voice screamed through the shopping center, "Emma!" A blonde woman in yoga pants and a designer jacket came sprinting toward them, her face white with terror. Emma broke free from the older guard and ran to her mother, who swept her up, sobbing. Oh my God, baby, I thought I lost you." The mother was crying, rocking her daughter, whispering frantic reassurances. The older guard approached her. "Ma'am, your daughter is fine. This woman found her in the parking lot." The mother looked at Margaret over her daughter's head, her eyes filled with gratitude and relief. "Thank you, oh God, thank you so much." Margaret felt a rush of emotion, of vindication, of being seen as human again. But she forced herself to focus. "Mom, I think someone was following your daughter." There was a van in the parking lot, white minivan with tinted windows. It was tracking her movements. The mother's face went pale. "What? Are you sure?" Margaret nodded urgently. "My dog sensed it. He's trained to detect danger, and when he barked, the van took off." "You need to report this to the police." The younger security guard interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension. "Ma'am, there's no evidence of any van." "This woman is homeless. She probably imagined it, or she's trying to get attention. Your daughter wandered off. It happens all the time. Everything is fine." The mother looked between Margaret and the guard, uncertainty crossing her face. The security guard pressed his advantage. "We'll make sure you get to your car safely, but I think your daughter just got distracted. There's no reason to panic." Margaret felt the dismissal like a physical blow. They weren't going to listen. They weren't going to investigate. Because she was homeless, her word meant nothing. Because Tank was a Pitbull, his instincts were worthless. She opened her mouth to argue, but the mother had already turned away, comforting Emma, and the older guard was gently guiding them toward a bench. The younger guard turned to Margaret. "Time to go, now, or I'm calling the police." Margaret felt Tank press against her leg. The dog was still tense, still alert, his eyes fixed on the parking lot entrance. She looked down at him and saw something in his body language, a certainty, a knowledge that this wasn't over. Every instinct she had developed as a nurse, every lesson she'd learned about trusting when something felt wrong, was screaming that this little girl was still in danger. But what could she do? She was nobody. She had no power, no authority, no credibility. The security guard was already reaching for his radio. She backed away, Tank at her side, and walked toward the exit, her mind racing. Outside, the heat slammed into her again. She moved to the side of the entrance, into the shade of an overhang, where she could watch without being immediately visible. Through the glass doors, she could see the mother holding Emma, the security guard standing nearby. Margaret's hands were shaking. Had she imagined it? No. Tank's reaction had been undeniable. That van had been following Emma. She was sure of it. But how could she prove it? Who would believe a homeless woman and her damaged rescue dog? 10 minutes later, the mother emerged from the shopping center, holding Emma's hand. They walked across the parking lot toward a silver SUV. Margaret watched, her heart pounding, scanning the parking lot for any sign of the white van. The mother unlocked her SUV, helped Emma into the back seat, and climbed into the driver's seat. She started the engine. Margaret felt a tiny bit of relief. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe the van was nothing. Maybe she really had been in the sun too long. Then Tank's growl cut through her thoughts, low and dangerous. Margaret's eyes snapped to where the dog was staring. 3 rows over, barely visible between 2 larger vehicles, was the white minivan. It had returned. The engine was running, and as the mother's silver SUV began to back out of its parking space, the van started moving too, slowly, deliberately, positioning itself to follow. Margaret didn't think. She ran. Tank sprinted beside her, barking now, loud, sharp barks that echoed across the parking lot. She reached the SUV just as it was about to pull forward, slapping her hand on the driver's window. "Stop!" she yelled. "That van is following you. Please, you have to believe me." The mother's eyes went wide with shock and fear, seeing this homeless woman and her aggressive dog suddenly at her window. She hit the gas, the SUV lurching forward, nearly hitting Margaret, who stumbled backward. The van accelerated, moving to follow the SUV toward the parking lot exit. Margaret ran after them, Tank matching her stride, but she knew it was hopeless. They were too fast. She was going to watch this child get taken, and there was nothing she could do. She stopped in the middle of the parking lot, breathing hard, watching the SUV turn right onto the main road, watching the van follow, maintaining a car length of distance. Nobody else in the parking lot seemed to notice. Nobody else cared. Just another invisible homeless woman screaming about nothing. Then she heard the sirens. A police cruiser came around the corner of the shopping center, lights flashing, and pulled into the parking lot entrance, blocking it. Another cruiser appeared from the opposite direction. Margaret felt confused, disoriented. Why were police here? The white van, now blocked from following the SUV out of the lot, suddenly reversed, tires squealing, trying to find another exit. But a third police car had already moved to block the back entrance. The van was trapped. The younger security guard appeared beside Margaret, his face shocked. "We thought you were crazy," he said quietly, "so we checked the security cameras. You were right. That van has been circling this parking lot for over an hour, following different children. We called the police immediately." Margaret couldn't speak. She watched as 4 officers surrounded the white van, guns drawn, shouting commands. The driver's door opened slowly, and a man emerged, hands up, his face blank. He was maybe 40, nondescript, the kind of person you'd pass without remembering, the kind of person who blended in, which was exactly the point. A second man was pulled from the passenger seat. The police searched the van, and even from 50 feet away, Margaret could see them finding things, could see their faces change, could see the way they suddenly handled the 2 men with barely controlled rage. An officer walked quickly toward the shopping center entrance, speaking urgently into his radio. Within minutes, more police arrived, and detectives in plain clothes, and FBI agents in windbreakers with yellow letters on the back. The parking lot was locked down. Shoppers were asked to stay inside. The white van was surrounded by crime scene tape. Margaret stood frozen, Tank pressed against her leg, unable to process what was happening. A female detective approached her, her expression serious but kind. "Ma'am, I'm Detective Sarah Williams with the Phoenix Police Department. I need to ask you some questions about what you saw." Margaret told her everything, her words tumbling over each other. The little girl alone, Tank's reaction, the van following, the security guards not believing her, the van returning. The detective listened, taking notes, asking clarifying questions. When Margaret finished, the detective looked at Tank with new respect. "That's one hell of a dog you've got there. He might have just saved that little girl's life." The detective explained that the van belonged to 2 men with outstanding warrants in 3 states for child abduction. They had been under surveillance by the FBI for weeks, but had managed to stay ahead of law enforcement, moving between cities, hunting in crowded public places where children got separated from parents. The shopping center security footage showed them targeting multiple children that afternoon, watching, waiting for an opportunity. Emma Cooper had been their chosen victim, isolated, alone, easy to grab. If Margaret and Tank hadn't intervened, if the guards hadn't finally checked the cameras, if the van hadn't returned, Emma would have been taken within minutes. By the time her mother realized something was really wrong, they would have been states away. The story broke fast. By evening, news vans were surrounding the shopping center. The FBI held a press conference showing photos of the 2 suspects, explaining their pattern of predatory behavior, crediting an alert citizen and her service dog with preventing a kidnapping. But they didn't name Margaret. They didn't know her name. She was just a witness who had already left the scene by the time the media arrived, disappearing back into the invisibility of homelessness. But Emma's mother knew. Ashley Cooper, 34 years old, had been brought back to the shopping center by police to review security footage and give a statement. She watched the tapes showing the van circling, showing Margaret protecting Emma, showing Tank's aggressive stance, warning off the predators. She watched the moment when Margaret chased after her SUV, trying to warn her, trying to save her daughter, even when nobody believed her. Ashley had broken down crying, understanding with horrible clarity how close she had come to losing Emma, understanding that a homeless woman she'd barely thanked had been the only person in that entire parking lot who saw the danger. Ashley had demanded to know who the woman was, where she had gone. The security guards could only tell her that the woman was a regular, came by a few times a week. They thought she lived somewhere in the wash. Ashley wasn't the kind of person to let things go. She was a corporate lawyer, used to getting answers, used to taking action. She had resources and she intended to use them. She left the police station with a mission: find the woman and the dog who saved her daughter's life. It took Ashley 3 days of searching, of driving around homeless encampments with Emma in the back seat, of showing a printed security camera image to every homeless person she encountered, before she finally found Margaret. She was in the ravine encampment, her small tent barely visible among the others, Tank lying in the shade nearby. Ashley got out of her car, Emma holding her hand tightly, and walked carefully down the rocky slope. She saw Margaret emerge from the tent, saw her face register shock at seeing them. "Margaret," Ashley said, her voice breaking, "I've been looking everywhere for you." Margaret stood frozen, unsure what was happening. Ashley continued, "The police told me what those men were. They told me that you and your dog stopped them. They told me that if you hadn't been there, if you hadn't trusted your instincts, I would have lost Emma." She was crying now, Emma crying too. "You saved my daughter's life and I didn't even believe you. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest. 3 years of carrying invisibility and shame suddenly fracturing under the weight of being seen, being believed, being valued. She tried to speak, but couldn't find words. Ashley closed the distance between them and hugged her, actually hugged her, despite Margaret's dirty clothes and unwashed hair. "Thank you," Ashley whispered against her shoulder. "Thank you for not giving up on us." What happened next became local news, then national news, then a viral story that spread across social media platforms with millions of shares and comments. Ashley Cooper wasn't just grateful. She was determined to change Margaret's life the way Margaret had changed hers. She used her legal skills and professional connections to launch what she called the Second Chance Initiative, a fundraising campaign with a simple message: the woman who saved my daughter is homeless, and that's not acceptable. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in from across the country, tens of thousands of dollars within the first week. Local businesses offered jobs. A property management company offered free housing. A veterinary clinic offered free lifetime care for Tank. The local news did a feature story telling Margaret's full history, her years as a nurse, the tragedy of her husband's death, the mistake that cost her everything, the descent into homelessness. The hospital that had fired her faced a public relations nightmare and quietly offered her reinstatement, which she politely declined. She didn't want to go backward. She wanted to move forward. But the most important moment came when Emma's story reached the FBI's national database and triggered something bigger. The arrest of the 2 men in the van led to the discovery of a network, a ring of predators who had been operating across state lines for years. Information found in the van, in combination with Tank's alert behavior that day, led investigators to a storage unit in Nevada, where they found evidence connecting the men to 17 unsolved child abduction cases spanning a decade. Tank's instincts, the training that had been beaten into him in fighting rings where sensitivity to aggression meant survival, had detected something law enforcement had missed. The FBI officially recognized Tank as instrumental in breaking a major case. The scarred Pitbull that people crossed the street to avoid was suddenly a national hero. 6 months after that day in the parking lot, Margaret Chen stood on a small stage in a Phoenix community center, wearing new clothes that actually fit, her hair clean and styled. Tank sitting calmly beside her, wearing a vest that read "Service Dog Hero" in bold letters. The FBI was presenting them with a civilian commendation for extraordinary service. Ashley and Emma sat in the front row, along with dozens of other families whose children had been victims of the ring Margaret and Tank had helped dismantle. The room was packed with press, with local officials, with homeless advocates, with people who had followed the story and wanted to witness this moment. An FBI agent stood at the podium, recounting the investigation, explaining how Margaret's intervention and Tank's alertness had provided the break they needed. He talked about the lives saved, the predators now in federal prison, the children returned to families who had given up hope. Then he invited Margaret to speak. She stood at the microphone, Tank at her side, and looked out at the crowd. For 3 years she had been invisible, her voice meaningless, her existence ignored. Now hundreds of people waited to hear what she had to say. "I'm not a hero," Margaret said quietly. "I just did what anyone should do. I paid attention. I saw a child who needed help and I didn't look away." She paused, emotion making her voice rough. "For 3 years, people looked away from me every single day. I stood on street corners, sat outside stores, slept in doorways, and people looked through me like I was nothing, like I didn't matter, like my humanity had somehow evaporated because I didn't have a home." She looked down at Tank, who gazed up at her with complete trust. This dog was thrown away too. People saw his scars and crossed the street. They saw a Pitbull and assumed danger. They saw a fighting dog and assumed he was ruined. But Tank wasn't ruined, Margaret continued, her voice stronger now. He was surviving. He was paying attention. And when it mattered most, when that little girl was in danger, he didn't hesitate. He protected her. Not because he was trained to, but because that's who he is. She looked back at the audience, meeting eyes, holding gazes. We throw people away in this country. We throw animals away. We decide who deserves our attention and who doesn't, based on what they look like, where they live, whether they fit our picture of someone worth caring about. And we miss things. We miss people. We miss opportunities to help each other. The room was completely silent. Margaret took a breath. "I'm grateful for this recognition, for what Ashley and Emma and all of you have done for me and Tank. You've given us our lives back. But I'm asking you to remember that there are thousands of people still out there, still invisible, still dismissed, still surviving day to day. They're veterans, they're mothers, they're people who had jobs and families and then didn't. They're human beings who deserve the same basic respect and attention that everyone else gets. Maybe the next time you see someone homeless, you won't look away. Maybe you'll remember that we're all just people trying to survive." The applause was deafening. Margaret stepped back from the microphone, suddenly exhausted, and Ashley was there, hugging her again, Emma wrapping her small arms around Margaret's legs. The press surged forward with questions, but Ashley's husband, a tall man with kind eyes, helped create space, guiding Margaret toward a private room where she could breathe. Over the following months, Margaret's life transformed in ways she'd never imagined possible. The Second Chance Initiative had raised over $300,000, enough to provide her with a small house, a used car, and a cushion of savings to rebuild her life. She enrolled in a trauma recovery program, working through the grief and PTSD of her years on the streets. She completed the recertification process to restore her nursing license, and began working part-time at a free health clinic that served homeless populations, using her experience to bridge the gap between healthcare and the people who needed it most. Tank became a certified therapy dog, working with children who had experienced trauma. His scarred face and gentle nature made him perfect for helping kids understand that survivors of violence could heal, could trust again, could be safe. He went to schools, to hospitals, to community centers, always patient, always calm, always sensing who needed comfort most. The vet who examined him found that despite his rough past, Tank was healthy and strong, probably only 5 years old, with many good years ahead. The torn ear became his trademark, making him instantly recognizable wherever they went. But perhaps the most meaningful change was what Margaret did with her platform. She started speaking at city council meetings, at fundraising events, at conferences about homelessness and social services. She told her story over and over, not to celebrate her rescue, but to highlight the systemic failures that led to it. The healthcare workers with no safety net, the impossibly expensive housing, the social services so overwhelmed they couldn't help everyone who needed it. The way society criminalized poverty instead of addressing it. She pushed for policy changes, for more funding for mental health services, for programs that helped people transition out of homelessness with real support rather than emergency band-aids. Ashley became her closest ally in this work, using her legal skills to draft legislation and connect Margaret with policymakers who could make changes. Their friendship, forged in that moment of crisis, deepened into genuine love between two women who had both been transformed by the experience. Ashley's family adopted Margaret into their lives. She came to birthday parties and holidays, babysat Emma, and her younger brother became Aunt Margaret. Emma, now in second grade, told everyone who would listen about the brave woman and her dog who saved her, showing off drawings she made of Tank to her classmates. The two men arrested in the van were convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping, conspiracy, and child endangerment. They were sentenced to life in federal prison without possibility of parole. At their trial, the prosecutor played the security footage of Margaret and Tank confronting them, showed the evidence found in the van, described the years of predatory behavior. The lead prosecutor specifically mentioned Margaret in his closing argument, saying, "A homeless woman and her rescue dog accomplished what law enforcement had been trying to do for years. They stopped these men before they could hurt another child. They reminded us that heroism doesn't require a uniform or a title. It just requires paying attention and refusing to look away." 1 year after the incident, on a cool October morning, Margaret stood in the same Desert Sky Pavilion parking lot where everything had changed. The shopping center had installed a small plaque near the entrance, commemorating what they called the Tank and Margaret Alert, a new security protocol training guards to take seriously any report of suspicious behavior, regardless of who reported it. Margaret touched the plaque, reading the inscription, "In recognition of Margaret Chen and Tank, whose vigilance and courage prevented tragedy and reminded us that everyone's voice matters." She felt Tank press against her leg and looked down at him, at his scarred face and torn ear and steady brown eyes. "You're a good boy," she told him, scratching behind his remaining good ear. "You've always been a good boy." Tank's tail wagged, his entire back end wiggling with joy at her attention. They walked back to their car together, Margaret's car now, bought with her own money, insurance paid, and registration current. She had a shift at the clinic in an hour, had patients waiting who needed someone who understood their reality. She had a house to return to afterward, with a bed and a refrigerator, and a yard where Tank could run. She had a life again, one built not on charity, but on the recognition of her fundamental human worth. As she drove away from the shopping center, Margaret thought about how close she'd come to not acting that day. How easy it would have been to ignore the little girl, to tell herself it wasn't her problem, to protect herself from further humiliation by staying invisible. How close Emma had come to being taken because the people with power and authority couldn't see past their assumptions about who deserved to be heard. How many times this same story played out differently, with no one paying attention, with no Tank to sense danger, with children disappearing into nightmares because the people who noticed were too easily dismissed. But that didn't happen this time. This time a woman who society had thrown away refused to throw away a child in danger. This time, a dog who everyone feared turned out to be exactly the protector everyone needed. This time, The invisible ones were the heroes, and that mattered. It mattered more than all the recognition and money and media attention combined. It mattered because it was proof that every human being has value, that every voice deserves to be heard, that the measure of a society isn't how it treats its most powerful members, but how it treats its most vulnerable. And that's how the extraordinary story of Margaret Chen and Tank ends, with one life saved, leading to thousands of lives changed, with one woman's refusal to be silenced, breaking open a case that had stumped law enforcement for years, with one scarred rescue dog reminding the world that courage and loyalty have nothing to do with pedigree or appearance, or what others think you're capable of. Have you ever ignored your instincts because you were afraid of being wrong? Have you ever looked away from someone who needed help because it was uncomfortable or inconvenient? Margaret and Tank's story reminds us that sometimes the most heroic thing we can do is simply pay attention, simply refuse to accept that someone doesn't matter. If this story moved you, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories. Share this with someone who needs to remember that everyone has value, that heroism comes in unexpected forms, that the people society dismisses might be the ones who save us all. Tell me in the comments, have you ever witnessed someone being dismissed or ignored because of how they looked? And what did you do? And leave your city too. I love knowing where you're from. See you in the next story. Remember that kindness costs nothing, but its absence can cost everything. Take care.